screen. I kind of snuck in a screen share while Heather was talking.
That's
But awesome, I see a thumbs up, great. Feel free, I do encourage questions. I think we'll probably run maybe an hour or so, might be a little under, so there should be time at the end for questions, but we have a pretty intimate sized group here, so feel free, if something, needs to be discussed before the end, can't wait till the end, feel free to chime in. I probably can't see the chat, so just give a little wave or something on your webcam and I'll address your question. But as Heather said, I'm Kenrick Hartman. I work with WJE in New York City. Do a lot of building enclosure work, roofing, waterproofing, facades. And I work with Doug. I don't know if Doug, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, Doug Stevie. I also work, as you guys know, I work for Wisjani Elsner in our New York City office. Similar to what Heather and Kenrick do, we do a lot of building envelope consulting on new and existing buildings.
So we'll have our emails at the end of the presentation in case you'd like to reach out to us. But we'll get going. The first maybe 15 slides, I'm going to breeze through in interest of time. So sorry if it seems a little bit rushed. Learning objectives, you probably have these already. Just a quick outline of what we're going to talk about. And first off, we just want to go through why this is important. Why are we talking about floodproofing more today than ever, right? So just a quick background on how we got to where we are today. So some questions here: are floods getting worse? Is that a problem? The short answer is yes. The floods are getting worse. We're seeing more severe storms and the repercussions of those storms. And the projections are going to continue that this is not going away anytime soon. So some examples, the first few slides are from Superstorm Sandy back in 2010. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Superstorm Sandy. Of course, here in New York, we're very familiar, but here's a low-rise, timber frame residential structure where the lower floor, was washed out due to flood water, but damage just isn't caused by only flood water. Here's an aerial shot of Breezy Point in Queens where a electrical fire started during Sandy, and you can see, can you see my mouse if I do this? Awesome. So you can see this area where one house, unfortunately, caught fire and the flames spread to this area. So while that's not your classic, quintessential flood damage, nonetheless, flood damage. Our infrastructure, this is the 86th Street subway station. Water came down, hung out. This is very common in most subway stations. This is also salt water. So while it's all the contaminants and whatnot in the water that the water carries, can damage the infrastructure and of course the inconvenience of shutting down your public transportation. The corrosive elements of the salt water, stuck around for a while, and that proved to be one of the biggest challenges. Similarly, here's the entrance to one of our tunnels. Floodwaters rushing down. Power outages. This image on the left is shot from New Jersey looking at Manhattan. That bright light you see is a transformer that is exploding, currently exploding. And then on the right image, you see the repercussions of that where more or less the entire downtown financial district in Manhattan is experiencing a power outage. And the list goes on, right? This is a shot of Rockaway, Queens, where you can see the piers that held the once boardwalk exposed, the boardwalk washed away. And then if you have a savvy eye, you can see all the sand that washed up from the beach and is now sitting in the street, right? So that's a cleanup. Despite returning the sand to the beach, cleaning it up off the street, of course, is a hassle. New York City is not alone. Most coastal cities, whether you're coastal being along a river or along the Gulf or an ocean, are experiencing similar flooding conditions. In 2017, Houston was hit by Hurricane Harvey, considered the wettest storm in U.S. history. We'll touch on this a little bit. But since that, almost on an annual basis, Houston has experienced substantial flooding, right, on unnamed storms, not hurricanes necessarily. And they didn't used to have, this frequent occurrence. So New Orleans, right, in 2005, Hurricane Katrina. And of course, it's not just a U.S. problem, it's a world problem. So this is a shot of Venice underwater, and they, of course, frequently have flooding problems themselves. So what's causing this? Without getting too political, climate change, right? Climate change is real. This is credited to the U.S. Global Change Research Program. It shows over the course of about 150 years or so, a little more, the rising temperatures across 4 data sets. And what does that mean? Again, I'm not a meteorologist, but I'm going to try to pretend like I'm one for a second here. But with the warmer air, it can hold more moisture. What we're finding is that warmer air is the catalyst for more severe storms. So we're getting more and more, 100-year storms, 500-year storms, and whatnot. And as I said before, Hurricane Harvey was one of the wettest storm rather that the U.S. has experienced, and the peak rainfall reading here is almost 61 inches, right in the course of about a week, right? So they got hit incredibly hard with rainfall. Our current stormwater management systems, generally speaking, are not built to handle such large rain events. So there's something called urban flooding, which in layman's terms is rainwater that hits an impervious surface and then has nowhere to go, right? So what did the stormwater, the drainage system itself can't handle this, or just doesn't have anywhere to pump to, its reservoirs are already full. That's proven to be a problem too in terms of infrastructure. Climate change is also raising sea levels. And Sandy, the wind and the rain, right, and Superstorm Sandy were not the biggest problem. I mean, it was still a hell of a storm, compared to most storms, but compared to your average hurricane, the wind and the rain wasn't that bad. The storm surge, however, proved to be a big challenge for us. And real quick, storm surge, for those unfamiliar, is more or less the result of a very large low pressure system, and hurricanes are generally low pressure, where the high pressure system surrounding the hurricane pushes ocean water down, right? And that low pressure that's at the hurricane level allows that water to rise. And that's really what the storm surge is, just this increased sea level at the area of the storm. And you can see some numbers here. These are in feet of the rise in the sea levels during the storm surge. Now, with rising sea levels, we don't necessarily need a Superstorm Sandy type event. It doesn't have to be that severe to experience flooding. There's something called high tide flooding. This is a nice graphic that shows it, where on the left here, 1950s, and of course it's just a schematic, but in 1950 sea level, you would have to overcome, a greater storm surge here to rise up to the point where your buildings will flood. Now with the higher sea level, you don't necessarily need a super large storm surge. You just need high tide, and that's what this is, high tide flooding. This is something Miami experiences fairly frequently, where it's they call it sunny day flooding, where there might not be rain, there might not be a storm, but Miami's built on a porous limestone, right? And there's aquifers, and there's groundwater that's within that limestone. As the high tides come up, it pushes that water up, right? So despite any rain events, you can have a week of sun, but if the high tide comes up high enough, it's going to push all that water up, and again, sunny day flooding. And it's not looking too good moving forward. And of course, we're having the conversations, but projections show that it's only going to continue. So as an industry, right, we're starting to pay more and more attention to it. So in New York here, after Superstorm Sandy, we took a look at our flood proofing protocols, or flood prevention measures, and started to sharpen our pencils. So we realized that the flood maps we were using, the FEMA flood insurance rate maps, often abbreviated as the FIRMS, the flood maps we were using were dated from 1983. So that was one. We want to start updating our FIRMS, our flood maps, to better represent the conditions that we're actually being exposed to. And then also New York City adopts freeboard. This is something that New York State implemented in 2010. And eventually New York City, when they start rewriting the code, would have to comply with the state minimums. But New York City did an emergency adoption of this provision to make sure that we're kind of beefing up our design elevations. Real quick here, you see my little equation here, and this is something that Doug's going to dig into in a bit, but I'll try to explain these briefly without stealing Doug's thunder. The BFE, the base flood elevation, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get that elevation from the FEMA flood maps. That being said, there is a chance that your local jurisdiction will elect to go above and beyond. and they'll have their own criteria. So if you're starting off on a floodproofing project, it's worth checking with whatever jurisdiction you're working in to see if they what they designed to. But nine times out of 10, it's probably going to be the FEMA maps. Freeboard is more or less a safety factor, if you will, that you add to that base flood elevation, and that safety factor, that freeboard, accounts for some uncertainties in the development of those FEMA maps, and also uncertainties for the projection, right? So if we design a building today, we want it to last in 10, 20, 30, 50 years, whatnot. So it's kind of building in a little bit of a buffer. So if things or when things get worse, we're better equipped to handle it. And that equals your design flood elevation. That's what you would design to ultimately. So in 2014, New York City updated Appendix G. Appendix G is also in the model codes, your floodproofing chapter in the IBC. Increased the design flood elevation. We just talked about that. Restricted some, again, Doug's going to talk about this, some occupancy restrictions below that design flood elevation. And then Appendix G just in general goes over your floodproofing approaches. So with that, I will turn it over to Doug. I'm controlling just for the group here, I'm controlling the slides, so Doug's just going to cue me.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Kenrick. So as Kenrick mentioned before, the ASC 24 is really the document that's used by the design industry. It's referred to in the various codes, model codes, and also the Massachusetts code, and is the current document that's being used. So the ninth edition of the Massachusetts Building Code will really bring you to this document, and so will Chapter 16. And there's some additional requirements in Massachusetts dealing with coastal dunes that aren't referenced in this document. So you need to understand your jurisdiction, and there may be there'll be some nuances and tweaks in New York that are different from what you guys have up in Boston, and they'll probably be different from what's in Florida and other locales. But in essence, if your model building code is based on 2015 or later, you're going to be using the 14 version of this document. The earlier document dated in 2005 it will be referenced if you're dealing with an earlier version of the IBC code. It also is correlated with FEMA insurance guidelines. So pretty much, if you follow this construction, you will be complying with what the insurance companies are gonna require. Okay, next slide. Okay, and they have a very good flow chart in this document. The steps you go through to determine if your building needs to be constructed and sited on the site in accordance with the document, and then to what level it needs to go. So next slide. So first, you have to determine whether you're in a flood hazard area, and that's basically any site that has a 1% or greater chance of flooding in any given year. And that's where we get our so-called 100-year flood elevation. So basically all of the maps will refer to this. So really there's some other requirements, unless the local authority having jurisdiction has made different determinations. It's pretty much that 100-year flood elevation. So if you're out of that, you're good to go. You move on to your next item on your to-do list. If you're in that zone, then you have to go into Chapter 1 and start going through this decision tree process. So go ahead, next slide. Okay, so you consult your FEMA maps to determine where you are and which type of zone you may be in. This is Lower Manhattan, and some of the maps that we use, you guys have similar documents up in Massachusetts. Next slide. And then you have to determine what type of a flood hazard area you're in, and go through the different processes. We said, yes, we're starting at Chapter 1. Now we need to define what design flood class we're in. Next slide. Okay, so we have 4 different classes, and this is very similar to risk classes if you're doing wind engineering. In the upper left-hand corner, low-risk facilities are Class 1. These could be agricultural buildings. Below that, the church Below that is a design class 3. It's a place of assembly. It's a little more of an important structure. So we're going to take a little more precautions with this. And the ultra conservative precautions we're going to take on the lower right-hand side. This is a class 4. These are going to be your essential facilities, your fire stations, your police departments, stuff like that. Very rarely will you be in one of these. Everything else is going to fall into design class 2. That's sort of the catch-all. So the guide says, is it 1, 2, 1, 3, or 4? If not, you live in class 2. Next slide. Okay, so then you need to determine if we are in a high-risk flood area. These could be alluvial fans, areas that are subject to ice jams, to mudslides, and also 2 different categories for coastal areas, in a coastal V or a coastal A zone. If you're in one of those areas, you have to go into Chapter 3. If not, we have to deal with Chapter 2, which is a little less onerous. Next slide. So if you're not in one of these areas, you're not up against the coastline, you're not in another area that's uniquely has floods, we have to still comply with Chapter 2 and some of the later chapters in the document. They're going to have different elevation requirements for where you have your design flood elevation. The use of fill is talked about and discussed. You don't want fill floating away, or you don't want it to erode away. Slabs on grades and footings, you're now going to start getting into some tie downs to prevent your slabs from becoming buoyant in a flooding event. Discusses foundation walls and different requirements for enclosures that are below the flood elevation. Next slide. Okay, now if we are in one of these areas, there are different types of geology or land masses. Next slide. This is more for a lot of these slides are going to be out west, but we have restrictions on construction in alluvial fan areas, where if we have a mountainous region, we have a canyon that may take a lot of water. We could have flash floods in this area here. So construction is prohibited in these areas. Next. It's also prohibited in areas that are prone to erosion. Next. Mudslides are another area, and areas that are subject to ice jams. Next slide. Now, however, building in these areas are permitted if there's a protective work, something that blocks the flow of water, such as a dam that's constructed, something that changes to mitigate the risk. If one of these things are constructed, then you're out of those areas. And that's why some of our flood maps keep changing. They keep changing because we have sea level rises, but they also change in these other areas if we have protective works, big civil engineering projects that are put in place to mitigate the risk.
So, yeah, if I can add to that real quick.
Yeah.
The maps, I believe, the FEMA maps, I believe, are updated every 5 years.
Okay.
And to Doug's point, you're not allowed to get around this, per the code. You can't build an alluvial fan or an ice jam area or a mudslide area unless the FEMA map is updated. You can't say, but they built a dam next to my job site. The FEMA map has to be updated, and then you can proceed.
Very good point. Thank you, Kenrick. Okay, and now some of our more restrictive requirements are if we're up against a coastline in a coastal high hazard area or a coastal A zone. Next slide. And basically this V zone is that coastal high area zone, and the A zone, they have to deal with the size of potential waves. So not only do these structures need to be designed for the elevation of where the water may be, these structures need to be designed so that they can resist the impact of waves and resist the impact of debris that may be getting washed around by those waves. And then we have this BX zone, which is the 500-year floodplain. And where I bring that up is if we have a structure that's a class 4 structure, that firehouse, it needs to be either on a piece of land, within, outside of that 500-year floodplain, or our elevations have to be increased, more so for like a police station or something like that. There will be special requirements for, say, a fire station, because you will have special requirements for building types that have to have access at grade level. But just that's why I bring that up, because that's how critical they're considering that design class 4. Next slide. So after we go through all that rigmarole and find out which chapter we live in and what we have to contend with, the base information that you need for your building is what this design flood elevation is going to be, and they'll give you the minimum level. So we're now talking about a building that's in a coastal high hazard or a coastal A zone, and we see this flood class on the left-hand side. So if we have an agricultural building, say a design flood class 1, our minimum floor elevation is going to be that design flood elevation. Whereas if you're in a class 3 design flood class, a place of assembly, then we have to either use the base flood elevation plus 2 feet or the design flood elevation, whichever is greater. So this will lead you to where that base design flood elevation is. Next slide. Okay, and at the end of ASC chapter, or ASC 24, excuse me, there's the last chapters 5 through 9 have to deal with all buildings that have to comply with the standard, have to comply with these chapters, and they deal with different materials, different flood proofing components, requirements for breakaway structures and other stuff like that. Next. So one of the big differences is whether you dry flood proof or wet flood proof. And basically dry flood proofing is where you're using the mass of the structure to resist the water. So your walls, your structure needs to be strong enough to resist the pressure of the water, and also in the coastal areas, the force from waves, the force from things that may be carried in the waves, and they need to remain relatively watertight. And we've got that here on the slide. Easier said than done, because you have to really look at all the penetrations coming in, and there's a lot of work that goes into getting this right. And when you're talking about an existing building and trying to retrofit an existing building, there's many times that there's penetrations you don't even know about that may be there that could circumvent this attempt to dry flood proof. One of the things is this design flood elevation. Dry flood proofing, you're not allowed to, anything below that, we're not allowed to have any residential space. So this could be a storeroom or not a critical place, but our residencies has to start at an area that's at or above the design flood elevation. Next slide. Wet flood proofing, on the other hand, the analogy of this is when you're in a beach community, you see the houses, they're all built on stilts up out of the water. So we're allowing the water to come in, we're allowing the water to come out. And that really reduces a lot of the stress on the structure, because one of the problems with the dry flood proofing and no flood proofing is if that water, as it hits the outside of the wall, it's going to put a lot of pressure on the outside. But then after the building floods and the flood waters recede on the outside, you still have all that water inside the building, which is going to put force on the wall coming back out. That's a big thing to contend with dry flood proofing versus wet flood proofing. There's some other things that are used in dry flood proofing where you may have man-made elements that are put in place. The new ASC 24 has requirements on what the minimum alert time has to be for you to be able to use, say, a deployable barrier or a floodgate. They're now requiring there be at least a 12-hour notice that's given before those things need to be employed. Next slide. Okay, Kenrick.
Take back. Yeah, so how do you choose, right? It's not always as straightforward as you might think. The top 3 options here, more or less are dictated to you, especially when in new construction. Again, we're going to focus on retrofits, although of course there's some overlap. But these are things that, per code say, thou shall, you should design for this flood class. You should design for, you're in this coastal zone, right? That's some more or less predetermined. But particularly in retrofits, there's an opportunity to elect to do more than maybe you have to. And a lot of the floodproofing jobs that I've personally worked on were owners electing to do the work. They didn't have some major alteration to the building, any substantial work that would trigger the need to update their floodproofing system. They said, hey, Sandy hit us hard, or insert storm name here, hit us hard. We don't want that to ever happen again. We're going to do something about it. So some examples here. This is in a cellar space in a basement. This is very simple, straightforward example, right? In a cellar space in downtown Manhattan, where on the other side of this wall is an oil tank. And during Sandy, flood water came in. Let's say the oil tank was full of oil, right? Oil's still lighter than water, but let's say the oil tank is half empty and now there's air in that tank, right? It's very, very buoyant. So flood waters come in, that oil tank starts floating and more or less rips away from any conduits and connections that are attached to it. Now oil's spilling out in this flood water, right? So you can imagine the mess that this created. And the owner said, I don't want this to ever happen again. I don't care if my cellar space, which I use for storage, gets wet. I don't want water in my old tank room. So that's what we did here. We went in and very simply took a look at their existing structure, which maybe the bottom 4 feet is cast in place concrete. We needed to go to meet our design elevation. We needed to go to about 3 courses up on the CMU. Existing CMU structurally was fine. We simply just added a waterproofing membrane to this, right? So very, very simple retrofit. A more complex retrofit and something that costs a lot of money and time, again, voluntary, at more or less an adjacent building to the one I just used here as a case study. They elected to harden, I'll say, structurally harden, reinforce this wall that my mouse is circling around, and then create a new wet dry line at this location. Now, what you're looking at on the upper side of this plan view is a parking garage, and on the lower side is leasable office space. And during Sandy, water came in through the ramp of the parking garage, filled this area, and then seeped through to the office space. Now the owner, put in new floodgates, which we'll talk about, some of these examples in a second, but new means to prevent water from even reaching this point to begin with. But as belt and suspenders decided to do this, now you can imagine this is a 60-foot tall, I think it was 18 or maybe 24-inch thick concrete poured, cast in place concrete wall with a significant amount of steel reinforcement. They needed to tear up the slab on grade, pour new foundations for it, break the slabs going up so that this could continuously run vertically through the existing floor slabs. It was quite a bit of work. Again, belt and suspenders, but nonetheless, it's worth it for some buildings to do that. Some design considerations. We'll go through these in a little more detail in the next few slides here. I like this little photo on the right. Someone planned ahead and it paid off, so good for you. Electrical and mechanical equipment, very often, again, in retrofits, this is what you're trying to protect, right? This is the stuff that causes the most headache, can shut your building down. So, some options there, some considerations at least. If you're trying to protect your mechanical equipment, instead of building a waterproof box around it, why not raise it up, right? Try to get out of harm's way. So we've seen buildings do this where instead of putting your switch gears and whatnot in the cellar space, they take away maybe even leasable space on the second or third floor or what have you, and try to move them up out of the floodplain. If you're designing a new structure, there's provisions that say you have to do stuff like this. You can't put your sensitive mechanical and electrical equipment in a flood area, particularly a wet flood area, for obvious reasons. Consider buoyancy. We talked about that. Conduits are tricky. Again, in retrofits, very tricky because this mechanical equipment, right, services something in the building, and those conduits, as they pass through the wet dry line, on the wet side, of the wet dry line must be watertight, or else water will get through in the inside of the conduit and travel right in the inside of the conduit right into the dry space. So it's very important that the conduit, when it's in a wet zone, be watertight. That could be done by just the nature of the conduit itself, that the conduit is of course watertight, or sometimes you can make life easy if you can take your conduit, and I wish I could show you, but if you were to run it vertically up above the floodplain, then turn back down, and then at that point you have a watertight conduit and tuck in, through your wet dry line. Sometimes that makes life a lot easier. Then you don't have to trace your conduit through its length, right? Then watch out for floor drains. Actually, I'm going to save this one, but I have an example in a second. Actually remove that slide in interest of time. So floor drains, a lot of times your backflow preventers and whatnot might be down the line, if you will, before you enter, the street, right? But for floodproofing considerations, make sure that your floor drains, which and while we're talking about mechanical areas, that your floor drain in the mechanical room doesn't connect to like a bathroom or something else that's in a wet zone, right? Because then if there's no backflow preventer between those two, water can go through that bathroom floor drain, flow right in and up into your, nice new flood-proof dry zone of the mechanical room. So that can be a really tricky thing to trace sometimes. Hardened walls, we talked about this. Here's an example of a new concrete hardened wall being built. Again, this is pretty light in comparison to some that I've seen, but nonetheless, you can imagine the type of hydrostatic pressure and loads these things will experience. So they tend to be pretty beefy. Proper waterproofing design. This could be a whole nother, discussion, at a later time. But long story short, you want to design for substantial hydrostatic pressure. Continuous continuity, make sure that you're tying in, so that the flood water can circumvent your nice new membrane. This is probably one of the biggest ones. Let's say the bottom two are probably the biggest ones in my opinion, in terms of things that might get overlooked. But durability of the membrane, and this speaks to the toughness of the material, the robustness, I should say. Is this not that you would do this, but you wouldn't want to use like a single ply type thing. You wouldn't really, that's not a good application, but you want something that has a little beef to it, redundancy to it. This is not something that can easily be tested for quality assurance purposes, right? You cannot replicate a flood in your building. So often you want to have some redundancy, a nice, thick, robust type application. And then the last bullet point on this list, and Doug mentioned this briefly, is something that I refer to as active versus passive elements, right? Things that passive being things that are built in to the system that once you construct it, you set it and forget it, if you will, right? Remember that? And it's there. You don't have to work to implement it. An active system, as opposed to a passive, would be something that your maintenance team or maybe an outside third-party vendor that the building hired to do this work would have to actively go in and implement. So that could be a floodgate, that could be a flood barrier, something that is not normally in place until the flood alarm bells are ringing, and then everyone rushes and puts this in. So again, I'll show a few examples in a second. Penetrations, mentioned they can be tricky. Here's a nice new hardened concrete wall with this open conduit penetration, all these wires coming through. There was no plan for this when we saw it, right? There was a plan after, but when we saw it, this was just going to be there. Of course, water can shoot right through it. And then your everyday conduits, you have your electrical lines going through, but these are not, generally speaking, watertight. So again, we kind of talked about this, but along the length of this conduit, we're standing in the wet zone here. Along the length of this conduit, this should be watertight, so water does not get in the conduit and travel through our nice new hardened wall. Access doors, right? I mean, this is arguably a penetration, a break in your waterproofing, but nonetheless, you need them. So we have these submarine type doors where you have these, we call them dogs, but these little, clasps that when you shut the door, you can, seal a gasket and make this watertight. There's other types of barriers too. Here's a flood balloons typically filled with water, right? Not air, so they don't float away. At the top of the stair, some towards the street. You can see this is downtown Manhattan. There's the East River right there. Floodgates, this is actually this is that example I gave you before with the parking garage and that very expensive hardened wall. Here's at the top of the ramp, here's hinged floodgates, very large, right, two of them. They're anticipating the structural load that's going to come from the wave action, right, that Doug mentioned. So here's already a substantial concrete pier, but they had to brace it with new steel. For redundancy, this building wanted to use two floodgates in case one didn't work, and this is a stackable floodgate. So these, given that they're kind of smaller in size, these would typically be stored at your building, but then the maintenance staff would have to come out and you can almost see, hopefully you can see it. It's almost like Lincoln logs, like, you know, you can stack them up 1, 2, 3, 4, right? You stack them up into tracks and build it up. They're gasketed so they seal. I mentioned the active and passive. As you're probably already thinking, there's obvious reasons to have more passive elements in your system than active, because these, you know, these stackables and those balloon type barriers, you know, so the people that install those have to know what they're doing. They have to know the system, right? They have to know the barrier and the balloon, but they also have to know the building and the plan to know that, hey, you know, when a flood's coming, when a hurricane's coming, you know, someone has to go stack these things up. Someone has to go inflate the flood balloons. You know, we can't have any pinholes in our system or else the whole thing doesn't work, right? It's only as good as its weakest link. So maintenance staff has to be continually trained. And if there's a changeover, you know, whether it be, you know, someone moves on to a different position or you know, a new person comes in, they have to be continually trained. Often buildings will do annual or semi-annual dry runs, right? And that's expensive. You know, you're paying your team to install these things. Normally it's overnight or on a weekend or whatnot. The bigger ones, like the flood balloons, maybe might be stored off-site, and then you would have to rely on an outside vendor to come truck it in and assemble it for you. So you can anticipate, you know, the logistics and the headaches and the uncertainties that come with these active systems. So if you can, my 2 cents is if you can build it into your building, you know, like a hardened wall type thing, I say do it. Here's another example of barrier. Here's a floodgate to the right, but then here's a stackable barrier, and this serves two purposes. One is to keep water away from the glazing system. This building did get hit in Sandy, but reportedly this glazing system held. But now the concern is that cars and other, you know, large debris and whatnot that are floating in this water can bang against the glass and maybe break, you know, that system that held before. And, you know, of course, a broken glass panel is not going to hold water. So they put this up to both, you know, prevent water, but also protect the glass. Oh, here's that slide. I thought I deleted it. So here's, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to leave time for questions, but it helps to see, you know, we're talking, you know, show some photos and whatnot. It helps to see it and plan to maybe appreciate how complicated this can get. So here's an example where the blue outlines are dry, I'm sorry, are wet floodproof areas, i.e. water is allowed to come in after the flood recedes. The water will either be pumped or drained out in some way. And then the red area is dry floodproof. The building said, I do not want by any means, I don't want a substantial amount. My carpet can get wet, but I don't want flood waters to come in to this area. So the question here is, you know, is this considered dry or wet floodproofing? And this is very common. It's very often a hybrid method. Maybe new construction where you have a little more control. You know, your parameters are a little looser. You know, you might see more dry floodproofing, you know, depending on the occupancy, you know, residential or commercial. But in a retrofit, you're often just trying to protect your key areas, right? Your sensitive equipment, in which case it's kind of a hybrid. You're letting some water in, but you're trying to block water, you know, at other locations. So some design considerations, a lot of these we went over, but the one thing I really want to talk about is this 3D design consideration. What you're looking at, I'm sorry, what you're looking at is a first floor plan, right? So you can presume, and it would be accurate to presume, that there's a basement or maybe several, you know, cellar levels underneath this area. Let's say that those cellar levels are allowed to get wet, right? So given that we're on the first floor and these blue areas are subjected to flood water, you can bet that the cellar levels would be fully flooded by the time the water, right, gets as high. So what happens, your structural guys, will typically design your floor slabs for gravity loads, right? That's probably the number one thing, whether it be live loads or dead loads. But in a flood consideration, like we're talking, where there's hydrostatic pressure coming up, right? Now your structural slabs have to resist a substantial load going in the upwards direction. Depending on the building and then the situation, you could overcome, whatever dead loads are imposing, force on your slab, and now you have an uplift condition, right? So this is something that if not, the retrofit condition can be very complicated, right? Very complicated and very costly to implement retroactively. We talked about floor drains, while we're talking about that too, it's not only structural, but that water cannot, of course, come through any conduit, any crack, any fish, whatever, cannot travel through this slab. So again, that wet dry line doesn't have to be, a vertical hardened wall. It can be a horizontal slab too. And again, this gets very complicated quick. You can imagine. But sometimes less is more. This is one we recently worked on where we were asked to come in and do a feasibility study. This building, again, with Sandy, was hit pretty hard, and are now entertaining doing some upgrades to their building to hopefully fare better in the next big storm. So what you're looking at here, I'm sorry to all my colorblind friends, but the green line is the exterior wall, right? The perimeter of the first floor. And there's no cellar space in this building. This is the lowest floor. And the red areas are more or less sensitive mechanical spaces. This is areas where the building does not want water to ever reach again. What you're looking at here in the light blue shading is the approximate floodplain. So you can probably deduce this, but I'll save you the trouble. So the floor slab largely is the same elevation once you're in the interior space. So if you can see my mouse, this is the main entrance here. You walk in the main entrance. This elevation, for our discussion purposes, is more or less the same elevation as this over here, okay? But now if I go to grade increases. My sidewalks and my streets go up in elevation as I move right to left. So you can see eventually the grade stops the floodwaters from proceeding further to the left, right, due to elevation. But on the inside, right, the same elevation. So water is going to keep going. If it's in here, it's going to keep going and fill the entire first floor. So we took a look at it and kind of, on the lines of what we've been discussing so far. Thought, hey, if we want to keep these areas dry, we can create these nice hardened walls. Maybe put a waterproofing membrane around these rooms, right? Take a look at the conduits, the floor drains, really go through it. But again, this gets complicated. So the genius moment, the aha moment came when we said, hey, what if, we created this U shape in the blue line here. And instead of just protecting these red areas, these critical areas, we're able to protect, most of their space. So this is over here in the upper right in the plan here is a parking garage. They don't really care if this gets wet. This is a lobby. They said, we don't care if this gets wet either. But if we were to allow the parking garage to get wet, the lobby to get wet, we can save everything else with much less trouble. So in this example, we said we can install a new planter wall on the outside of the building. Our hardened wall, would be in the parking garage here, and then continue through. And instead of trying to worry about all these conduits that are coming out of the mechanical areas and all the floodgates and and everything, why don't we just try to build it in and create as many passive elements as possible? And once you install this, the building never has to worry about it again. There's only one gate, and that's right here, right? So this was a win. I mean, the building like this, and then
yeah, to go back what Kendrick is saying, it is one of his projects. In the addition of a new planter outside the building not only prettied up the building. The building was not a great looking building. Really did a lot for the aesthetics of the building and solved the a tricky floodproofing issue as well. So sometimes you can add things to make life easier.
That's actually a great segue. We're talking about retrofitting buildings, but maybe, we can also say, protecting buildings, existing buildings from floods, right? It sounds like it's the same thing, but not quite. So we can stop water before it even gets to our building. And this, of course, is not something that maybe you or I would necessarily design ourselves, although we could be, a waterproofing type consultant on one of these teams. But there's plenty of infrastructure projects or ideas to flood-proof entire areas. So I mentioned the subway water is going down our subway here on the left. That's of course a flooded subway. On the right, that's the same subway station. But now we have
actually that picture on the left, that's water coming up from leaking somewhere else into the station. So that's not water that got in that door. It's water that came up.
Oh, so I actually got that wrong then, because the one on the right is not the same then. So sorry, thank you, Doug. Nonetheless, flooded subway, and on the right here we have these walls here, and then there's gates, right? And this is an area that would be exposed to floodwaters, rather than what Doug's saying is this came up from another source. At this area, water would be exposed. This would be a flooded area. So we're trying to stop water from even getting down into our subways, right? Some infrastructure ideas, a lot of this, when you think of flood walls and deployables, I picture like, big, massive concrete walls surround, like almost like a dystopian, type city. We're building concrete walls around our nice city where before we could just see the water and, the ocean. But it doesn't have to be like that, right? So this is something that is being implemented in New York City, called the Big U, big infrastructure project stretching around lower downtown Manhattan, up the East River, up the east side, where we're creating this barrier, right? Our wet dry line is no longer necessarily dependent on the buildings. We're stopping floodwaters, from even reaching our buildings altogether, right? And this is obviously a big project in its early stages, but something that is proceeding. And the idea here is that we're creating park spaces, community spaces, it's just so that, the berms in our landscape and the hills, grassy knolls and whatnot are at such an elevation that it would stop floodwaters, right? That our skate parks and whatnot, the ramps are at such an elevation that it would stop floodwaters. So this is largely usable space, but in a flood condition, no one's using them. It's going to help stop the floodwater. This one, I like this one. In Venice, they have, maybe you're familiar, they have something called the MOSE, which is an acronym in Italian. I'm not going to make that attempt, but more or less have these floodgates that are embedded in the seafloor, and if the seawater gets, I think it's above like 130 centimeters, these floodgates deploy and will block. They're positioned at these little channels here. I'm not sure what you call this, and they'll stop the rising, storm surge, the rising water here from coming into this area. Here's Venice, and flooding the city, right? And this was a long time coming. There was a lot of controversy with this project. I actually had to, before our talk here today, I had to Google it to make sure it was accurate. And apparently it is delayed, but since the last update, they're ahead of schedule. And they used it for the first time in October 2020, and it worked. They had a potential flood condition. They put them up, and it stopped the water. So I encourage, if you're at all interested, I think it's pretty cool. You should Google it. They have some nice videos of how it works. But other people are. It's not just New York, right? It's not just the U.S. Other people are engineering and using their ingenuity to have creative solutions to real problems. Miami is another good example. They're raising the roads. This shot on the top here is the before. You can see, obviously it's flooded, but you can see the elevation of roughly the elevation of the road, if you can imagine it through the floodwaters, and this curve here, and you see the people eating, their lunch over here. And this is after. This is a real photo. They raised these roads. Right now it's above the restaurant down here, right? Same elevation at the restaurant. And that serves two purposes. One is to stop floodwaters from traveling from one side of the road to the other, right? Because it's strategically above the flood elevation. But two, this helps emergency vehicles, right? And this is, a flooding, a hurricane, it's an emergency condition. Your police and fire trucks, have to get around. So this allows, vehicles to still move around the city, and also people to evacuate. Those who are late in the game, or if the storm came quicker than anticipated, these roads should be above the flood. So you're able to still get out of the city if needed. Miami's also replacing some of their storm drainage. We talked about the urban flooding a little bit, and then their sunny day flooding problem. They're trying to upgrade. And then on top of that, they're filtering and trying to clean the water as best they can before they pump it back out. remove the pollutants, and then raising the seawalls around the perimeter of the city and the coastal areas. The cautionary tale, I attended a talk. I actually stole this from a talk at APT a few years back of someone who is a New Orleans native and got their PhD in I forget what, but to do with more environmental sides of floodproofing. But she shared this photo of the Mississippi River here, right? You can well, you can see it here, but you can imagine how high this river is in a unflooded condition compared to those homes down there, right? So, I mean, obviously this is, except for Katrina, really, this is holding up fairly well. But there's only so much you can do to control nature, right? You know, this is a river, it wants to move and meander, and we're seeing, you know, sediment is now depositing within the riverbed when before it might be deposited at, you know, as the river takes turns, you know, the oxbow effect and whatnot. So we're trying to control nature in a way that it's not wanting to be controlled. So I don't have a clear answer for that, but just a cautionary tale that you know, it's not good to try to control nature. It's more, in my opinion, it's better to set yourself up to best react in a resilient way, right? To use the catchphrase, in a resilient way to resist what nature throws at you. So that's what we have. That's our email, but we have 5:30. I think we have half an hour left. I'd love to open up to any questions you may have. Questions or comments?
We didn't put everybody to sleep, did we, Kenrick?
Yeah.
I got a question for you. If you can hear me.
Sure.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yeah. So there was one example where you had a building whose glass windows had held up during Sandy, but then sort of thinking ahead, they were like, if there's cars floating by, we don't want them to smash into the windows and break them and let the water in. And so you built a protective steel wall, kind of knee wall. Is that something is that permanently fixed there so that it's blocking off light through the windows, or is it something that can retract or otherwise?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, thank you for that. So what this is still a work in progress. So at the end of the day, down here where my mouse is, this actually quite a bit of work has been done here. But if you were to go to the building today, you would see granite cladding down here.
Oh, okay.
So this is clad in granite, trying to match what's above here, although this has since been replaced still. What you would see is this shelf angle, and that slightly protrudes the granite cladding. Everything above the shelf angle is removable.
Cool.
Right, so that shelf angle is below the glazing. If you're inside, you would not even know it's there. From the outside, you just see the toe of the angle.
Yeah, great, thank you.
When you say removable, do you mean like retractable?
These are stored. Well, they store them in their basement, but yeah, the engineer, the building maintenance team, you know, loads them up on a cart and they put them in the basement. When the flood, you know, alarm bells ring, they wheel them out and they pick them up and put them in.
Gotcha. Thanks.
They look pretty heavy.
Yeah, that's that's why they install them. I don't.
Another thing I could just point out that we didn't talk about in the presentation, you know, our presentation obviously is New York centric because that's where Kenrick and I practice. But just doing some research for our talk here, you guys have a coastal flood resistant design guidelines up in Boston where they're doing overlays and putting what they predict to be a 40-inch rise in the sea level, where they expect the sea level to be, that design flood elevation to be in the year 2070. So if you compare what you have now to what that map looks like in the future, it's a big difference. So, and it's a great document, and they also have good examples of different case studies similar to what we presented, just in a different mindset, but very, very good document.
Thank you.
And another question. So thank you guys. It's a wonderful presentation. It's both pragmatic and looking ahead. Is most of the work you do retrofitting?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I think Doug and I both have experiences doing new design work though. But I would say in terms of, not in terms of scale and dollars, but in terms of number of projects, most of it's retrofitting for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of challenges there because we're dealing with the existing layout and, all those hidden penetrations and things.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is obviously too, I mean, given that we're in New York and we got hit with Sandy, fairly hard with Sandy, owners are again electing to do this work. It almost, you kind of have to experience it yourself before you start throwing the dollars at it to do it. So I can imagine in a coastal city that has not been recently hit hard, they might be more reluctant to spend the money on it. So, but maybe by code on new buildings, they have to, is my point, so in the city here in New York, we're probably seeing more retrofits.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if I haven't personally seen any of this type of barriers in Boston. Me personally, but I know because I know we did get a big storm surge, I think a couple years ago, and there were dumpsters floating down in the Seaport district and stuff. So I think, well, over there it's a lot of new buildings, so I think they're building with resiliency in mind. But yeah, there's a lot of existing buildings that'll have to consider some of these floodproofing measures in the future.
The building
can
where the
add-
VSA is located, right near the Fort Point Channel in Boston, experienced some flooding 8.5 years ago. I guess that was Hurricane Sandy. And they have built into the sidewalk like footings that deployable gates could be inserted into.
Yep.
And the locations of the places where they can be inserted are some removable bricks that have a little symbol on them. So that's one place where Boston has
Okay.
moved ahead.
And that's something that I didn't have a good, I'm glad you brought that up, Brett. I didn't have a good example for that, but that is very common where you try to create a barrier like around your building. And I brought this slide back up on the screen here. We were not the first engineering architecture firm that this building contacted. The first guy said that they want to do more or less what you described there, where they want to install this barrier system all the way around here. And it was going to cost millions and millions of dollars to implement. Again, talking about active versus passive, it's fully active. So to install this, even if the flood never comes, or even if it's just a dry run drill, it is so involved and time consuming and labor intensive that they said forget it, and they reached out to us, and this is what we came up with. So yeah, there's often multiple solutions, to the same problem, but sometimes you just got to like take a step back and think about it strategically about what are we trying to do here, and how best to do it, because there are multiple solutions.
Right. And sitting down with the owner and finding it is a real critical component of that, and finding out, what is sensitive to them and what is not sensitive, because one building and one owner may have a different perspective than the others. And this is when we're doing, voluntary upgrades.
We're doing a hotel over by the market. And the hotel is partially over the Big Dig, and it's in the floodplain, and we're doing all kinds of passive barriers, and it has a subsurface or below grade utilities. We didn't have much choice in the matter.
Yeah.
So all that waterproofing, it's massively expensive, very time consuming, full-time inspections. MassDOT has a lot to say about it. The city of Boston has a lot to say. The owner has a lot to say. And of course, There's storage for trash for the marketplace. So it's a very complicated thing to solve it for a new building. And I have to say that solving the problem for an existing building, I'm not sure which takes more creativity. Looking at your plan that's on the screen, you know, you must have had some good head scratchers.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's true, and like I said, in this, I'm focusing on this particular case study here, but the real head scratchers were again, these are all mechanical spaces, and there's conduits, and they're running everywhere. They're you know, popping out of this room in all directions, and they're tightly spaced and very difficult to flash, and we just got rid of all those those headaches by saying, hey, let's just build a new planter wall on the outside, you know, and then continue, you know, all of a sudden things got simple. And it's not, you know, this is one of those things where it's like, you know, I probably thought of this, I was probably, you know, taking a shower or walking the dog, you know, and then all of a sudden like, oh, you know, one of those things. You're like, well, wow, that makes sense. What if we did it that way?
And although the solution is presented on paper here, you really need to be you need boots on the ground. You need to walk the site with multiple people and looking at things differently. And you really need to be up close and personal with the building. This is something you can't do in your office. You got to get to the site.
I think your point earlier about thinking in 3 dimensions, I think you can't stress that enough. The item of the water coming up the subway, you know, who would have thought that? Well, yeah.
Yeah, water will move where it wants to. You know, if the elevation's right, it'll travel. So it gets, like I said, I probably said it 10 times, but it gets very complicated.
I was wondering if when you're retrofitting, you're going to probably find some exposed steel that you don't want to be the salt water be touching it. And I wonder if you have words of wisdom on coatings and kind of retrofitting materials. This might be useful also for new buildings, although you could probably avoid most of the steel.
Yeah, I think they have different types of really high performance coatings that you could put on steel, but I don't think it's going to be, you know, you're only talking about being in a flooded condition for a little bit. I think the corrosion really comes into place when you're talking about electrical equipment. You know, those subway stations pictures, you know, any kind of tracking equipment, signaling equipment has to be replaced. We had, when Sandy came, we were in the middle of our ground zero rebuilding, and we had 17 feet of standing water down on the path tracks. All of that electrical equipment and all of that had to be replaced.
Frightening. Thank you.
Well, I have a general question for you guys. This isn't the kind of work that most architects get into, although I think more and more of us will. In terms of a clearinghouse or organization or sub-organization, where would we turn if we wanted to participate in regular discussions on this very topic?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I could refer you to IBEC, the International Institute of Building Enclosure Consultants, which Doug and I are very active with. Doug and I actually presented a similar talk with them a few years back, specific to Sandy. But there's not a lot. I mean, Doug, feel free to chime in, but I don't think there's a lot of discussion out there right now. It's really in these, you know, niche areas.
And you're right, and it's one of the new design. You know, it's really being governed by ASC, which are engineers. But I would argue that the retrofit is as much an architectural practice as it is anything else, because it's a problem. And our architects are trained at problem solving. So to be able to get to a building like this and figure out a unique solution. So I think that architects can do it. You know, when you get into some of the work in terms of making sure the walls are strong enough, you obviously need an engineer involved. But you know, it's something that our discipline can tackle.
I can share too. Maybe I'll send it to Heather afterwards. Doug and I wrote a paper on this a while back. I mean, the discussion, of course, is nice, but I can distribute a paper that you can reference later on that kind of summarizes what we've been talking about today.
One of the great challenges of our own careers, as well as what we have to do now that we're guiding the younger folks, is the question of, when you do a detail, you have to look beyond the detail, because it's usually a two-dimensional section, whether it's in plan or elevation. And if you don't think beyond that section, you may have a failure problem. And with this cluster of issues you've been talking about, we now have to think not only beyond the section, but in time. So all of these things are happening, not now, but at some point in the future. And where the problem will come from may not be just beyond the section. It may be totally out of the section. It may be below the section. It may be to the left of it. So where it comes from, you've got to be really thinking three-dimensionally, but maybe even four-dimensionally in that case. So it's a fantastic challenge.
Yeah, very much agreed. Yeah, and frankly, I like the work because it's taking concepts and principle and knowledge that you may already have and applying it in a very different way. And every building's different, right? It's in a different flood area. It's different construction. Different areas, need to be protected. Some other areas can get wet. So it's very unique. Every time it's unique. There's no copy and paste with this work.
Have you guys run into any books on the subject? I haven't looked into this, but you've got my curiosity up.
Yeah, there's
Articles?
Yeah, there's that coastal flood resistant design guidelines up in Boston. We have a very similar document in New York, and maybe Kenrick and I, maybe we can feed those references to Heather, and she can distribute to amongst the community here.
Yeah, that'd be great. We could probably, I'm sure we could get it on the back website for people to reference. And
yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. I mean, yeah, thanks, Kenrick and Doug. It was a great presentation, lots of information, and I think you did it really well. So thank you.
Well, thanks for everybody for tuning in.
Heather, this presentation was recorded, is that right?
Yes, yeah, it'll be up on the back website within a week or so, I think.
Fabulous. Looking forward to seeing it.
Great. Yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
That was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Doug, I like your background.
Yeah. I want to move to our Hawaii office now. Take care.
It does. It looks like you're in a vacation mode there with the shirt too.
I'm in a permanent vacation mode now. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great night.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I was only gonna have time to stay till 6, so but we can chat real quick with the board.
So I have I don't know if you guys can share my screen,
Yeah.
but I have a couple of questions for us to program the next couple of months, and a couple of follow-up things. I don't know if Brian is still on the call, or maybe someone else can answer this question, but from the February meeting notes, we have like a part 2 And I don't know if you're still interested in doing a part 2 presentation.
So what ended up happening, we did the Savannah trim, ended up being part 1. And so then today or this month was kind of our part 2. So yeah, the Savannah trim, yeah, was part 1 of our little mini series here on climate change and rising sea level.
Got it.
Yeah. So we're good with that one. And then I think we were.
Wasn't a question for me, right?
No, it was a follow-up item.
Okay.
That you had. And I didn't know if, how it all played out.
Okay, great.
And then kind of like looking through. Sorry, Heather, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just going to say that, yeah, I know we had talked about doing like a 2-part kind of series on this. I was just wondering if there was more interest and if there's more presenters to kind of continue the discussion on the climate change or rising sea level, or I don't know if there's anything going on with a seawall or anything in Boston, but yeah, just seeing what people thought about that.
I mean, we've been doing work with FM Global and some of their flood mitigation scope, where the buildings they insure, they've been requiring upgraded protection, essentially. And we did a presentation with them, and I think we had a presentation separately put together for the Northeast region, which has been postponed several times. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on out there. I think, New York, like they said, has had a big case that's cost money and people are trying to prevent it. Boston has had some high tides or king tides, but not a lot of damage yet, and so it's not as been as much of a priority. We've seen some clients locally want to try to do something to protect, but it then comes down to a cost issue of do they want to spend the money? And sometimes they have, and sometimes they haven't, based upon the cost.
Right.
I think the big thing locally would be the Norwood Hospital, which flooded last fall.
Yeah.
We're working with them on some items, and depending on how that goes, we might be able to present something.
Okay.
I did reach out to Julie Easton. I know her, she works at Weston and Sampson, about presenting, because I know that she worked on, I think it was like a park wall, but she recently had a baby, so I don't know if she's up to present, but I asked her if anyone else in her office would be, and she hasn't gotten back to me. I reached out to her via LinkedIn, so I'll see if I can get her email and try to reach out to her a different way, since LinkedIn isn't always the best way to reach out to people.
Okay, that'd be good. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I have anyone else. I kind of tapped into Kenrick and Doug there. Yeah.
Let's see. So I had a note about Greta reaching out to Goody Clancy, and I don't know if that was kind of like a dead end street, or if she ever got a chance to do that, or what the topic was about. I was just kind of going through my email and figured.
I think she did mention that, like in the beginning of the meeting today. I don't think they said it wasn't a good time to present. I think it was a public job or yeah, something like that, it just wasn't, there was a lot involved, so it wasn't a good time to do presentation on that one. It's my understanding.
Gotcha. Okay. And then I know that Wei, he said that he was interested in presenting about timber facades. And then I know that you reached out to him about April, and I don't know if he responded to you, but maybe we can reach out to him again and ask for a June presentation if we want to choose that topic, because it is, I don't think it's very relatable to like flooding.
Right. And I know that I think it was Rick or someone had pointed out that we recently did do a timber presentation. So basically if it was going to be different and have some different information, we were maybe a little more open to it, but otherwise it sounded like it was going to be just a repeat of something we recently did.
Yeah, because I think we did one last year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So I can reach out to him, or since you already reached out to him, either one of us, just asking like what.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that and ask him what the specifics of what that was, and if he's still interested.
And then I guess depending, we can ask if he's interested for June or not. I'll see if I can reach out to Julie. Hopefully she can put something together for June. So we have a couple of options there.
That'd be cool. That'd be good.
Does anybody else?
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah, and then for July, I remember, yeah, we were talking about, oh yeah, you have it noted there, like doing the hands-on kit like we did the end of last year. I thought that was pretty cool. It'd be cool to do something similar, obviously not the same one. I haven't done much research on my end, so I don't know if anyone knows of anything right now, but otherwise maybe search around.
Did Shane, I saw the notes there, but it looks like maybe Sarah lost her connection. Did Shane say that he can do one of those kit things?
I don't know. I'll read. It's with Shane, right? Henry Rett.
Yeah.
I can reach out to him.
Mm-hmm.
Have you done any from Shane or Henry or?
No, the only one I've ever done was through the ICI, or not ICI, IMI last year.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what we did. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and if we don't find like a hands-on one, maybe we.
Yeah. I mean, Richard, do you know what we usually do in the summer? I can't remember if we take July off or if it's August off.
August, right?
We traditionally take it
August. Yeah.
Okay, August. All right.
There's one presentation I'd like you guys to keep your ears peeled for that I'd love to see, which is, and may not exist, somebody who's successfully done a commissioning job that involved full commissioning per the ASTM standard. I keep getting requests for proposals for jobs that are lead. There's two clients that keep asking me. They do commit. They're mechanical engineers who want to build an enclosure component, and I do these elaborate proposals, and they always get rejected. And I'm sure they get rejected because the price is too high, even though I've told them, you really want this? And they say, yeah, we got to do it. So then I'm sure what happens is the owner sees it and they said, oh, that's not the scope. We can't afford that scope. So I just don't know if anybody had a presentation to address that issue. I'd be very interested in it.
So, I mean, commissioning happens on jobs. It's something that does happen. What's your definition of full commissioning? Is what I'm curious about.
Standard.
Like every single thing that's in there, not just picking X, Y, and Z. Okay.
This is an old problem. I do commissioning for MSBA all the time. Yeah. Even their scope had a lot of stuff in it. And I didn't do the original proposal. And I saw the numbers and I asked, what's in this? And, oh, we're going to do just what we normally do some inspections and review submittals. I said, well, that's not what their contract says. And, so we had a conversation with the owner, the boss, and we specifically asked, do you really do full commissioning? Oh, yeah. He had no clue what he wasn't doing. He never had read the damn thing. And it happens all the time, over and over again. And so I'm just curious. I know Way, I wish he was on the call because he's claimed one time he did actually do that, maybe I should reach out to him, see if he wants to give a talk. It's old. Was about 2 or 3, 4 years ago, but he got a job. He was when he was still with WJE, and he said, I got the job. $300,000 fee. Over $200,000, I think.
You said 300,000?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How big was
That
this
must
building?
Bought a new car that year, I'm sure. Somebody did.
Richard, a lot of the problems though, especially with LEED, is that LEED has a different level of what they list in their requirements than ASTM. So a lot of people who are going with LEED aren't going to do that full amount because of the cost. And it probably really depends at the end of the day on how complicated is the project. So if you're doing something custom or unitized, then you probably want to do something that's more heavy. But if you're doing something that's standard construction, standard, industry detailing, you may not need to do quite as much. So it does vary job to job, but I agree, LEED is much, much less, or at least what people are getting for commissioning, much less than what ASTM might say is the, full commissioning.
Problem is the proposal requests I see say they want to do it per LEED 4.0 or whatever. And when you read LEED 4.0, it refers to the ASTM standard. It doesn't say.
It does.
Yeah, it does, right. So if it refers to it, doesn't that mean you have to meet what it says?
Most people that I've seen with LEED projects only want the scope that's show in the bullets in LEED, which is basically no site visits, no testing, very, very, very minimal.
But that's the problem. When
it's a big problem.
What do you want? And I'm working with someone who's 10 rungs down on the ladder, so they're not in the inner loop. They just see what the request is to meet. We've got to meet LEED. And that's the only answer I get.
We did cover some of that in that Building Enclosure Council training for commissioning. That there is a difference between these, and there's a big scope difference too. Big scope difference depending on what you decide you need to cover or include.
Well, maybe you could give a presentation on it. That'd be great.
There you go.
I'd love to.
You got to find the right client. That's the big hint. Find the right client who wants to pay for it.
No, I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to just submit it. I would love to get these jobs on the lower scope, but the people I'm dealing with don't know that when you're doing LEED, they don't really want you to do what they say they want in the thing, which is they refer to the ASTM standard, but they don't really need you to comply with it. So I've never seen that in writing anywhere that even though it says it, you don't have to comply with it. And so, I mean, I just don't know how to deal with that. It's not that I want to get the big scope. I mean, it'd be great, but I just don't want to waste my time doing a proposal for somebody that doesn't know what they're going to ultimately buy. So I don't know if you would have a presentation that would warn people or give heads up as to what the standards really are.
I could find the PDF that we gave to CSI about a year and a half ago. And I think it was a little bit more about the process, but it did talk a little bit about the differences, and we could probably try to, increase that discussion more of what you do and what's added, what's not added. But it gets pretty subjective between what the client wants. I mean, I have tons of RFPs that none of them make any sense, right? They tell you they want site visits. They don't tell you how many. They don't tell you how often. There's so many of these RFPs are so generic that you really got to go in and say, okay, this is what we carried, and negotiate more or less depending on what they want to do. But this
was the cause of the big breakup at Beck National. Rick, what's his name? Rob Kistler and a whole bunch, and what's her name? The lady from Texas, was Jenny again, I think. I forget her name. They wanted to have an ASTM standard that was usable, and Nibs wanted the whole kitchen and the bathroom sink, and they got kicked out and they were pissed off as a result. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. Anyway,
it'd be great if you had a presentation
send me
where I
that
could
PDF
break it
and
into
see if
tiers.
that answers my questions.
Now Rob Kisser's retired, so who cares?
The state-of-the-art question.
What was that, Steve? Did you say something?
Yes, it'd be really great if we had a presentation that could kind of neatly break it into tiers in terms of, you know, what would qualify for ASTM, what would qualify for the various lead points, and then where the gray area and overlap is between all of them. Because my typical directive is put together a proposal that does the absolute least that will still give me my lead points.
Is there anyone on the call who works for a lead consultant, or can we get one? Because I mean, I have most of that in the proposal, but we always hedge it or hedge our proposal that, you know, someone from lead needs to kind of comment on it. So it'd be good to have that conversation with a lead professional as far as what have they seen. Because I think lead version 3 was starting to be worked out, but it was still in innovative credits, but they had enough explanations on what they needed. Version 4 kind of went all the way back again to the beginning, and it's pretty bare.
I just went through this exercise about a month ago with, I think the firm was A10. I could reach out to who I spoke to there.
Yeah, Atelier 10. Yeah, that's who I would reach out to.
If they know a bit more, perhaps, you know, could, you know, speak on this.
I think I've worked with Code Green. I could always talk to them too.
How about the Green Engineer?
I've worked with them before.
Yeah, I have a friend, Rick Moore, who is also a lead consultant that I could contact and see what he's done, what he's seen. He's been around for a long time.
Maybe we all just reach out and see what we come back with next meeting.
All right.
Sure. I mean, so I'll forward my presentation CSI, which can be tweaked, but it'd be good to hear what the lead people are seeing and what they're seeing approved, or more importantly, what are they seeing rejected for points?
I agree with you 100%, Brian, about, I think the approach is to get a lead, somebody who specializes in lead to address this question.
They may not be able to go into details on what commissioning is, but they at least know what they know has passed or not passed.
That's right.
Well, I'd have them look at the ASTM standard and see if it's referenced. Do they want all of that? Do they really need all of that? Because clients don't want to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sounds like a good topic we'll shoot for that one for July then. And we can all email who we know and we'll follow up. Yeah, next meeting or just via email. How about that? That works for everyone.
Well, thank you. I've got to run. I've got another meeting at 7 and I have to.
Yeah, I got to run too. Well, good to see y'all, and yeah, have a good rest of your week.
You too. Bye, Heather.
Bye,
Thanks, Heather. You too.
Bye, everybody.